welcome you and thank you for joining us today as we convene this Nebraska lecture, our first this year in the Chancellor's Distinguished Lecture Series. The Nebraska lectures are sponsored by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Research Council in cooperation with the Office of the Chancellor and the Office of Research. The Research Council, composed of faculty from across all disciplines at UNL, supports a number of competitive awards and programs designated to encourage and enhance research, creative and scholarly activities for all members of the UNL faculty. The Nebraska Lectures are one such program. The Nebraska Lectures are an interdisciplinary lecture series designed to foster communication among students and faculty in different academic areas and among citizens of Lincoln and Nebraska. The Research Council chooses Nebraska lectures from UNL faculty on the basis of their major recent accomplishments and the lecturer's ability to communicate this work to a multidisciplinary audience, like we have today here. Dana Fritz, faculty member in art and art history, is chair of the Research Council. I invite Professor Fritz and other members of the Research Council to stand so we may acknowledge their support of this series.
I picked myself.
I want to say that on a personal level, this is really very exciting for me because when I go to DC or wherever I travel, I hear about our faculty members and their accomplishments and what a wonderful impact they are making, and yet we don't sometimes get the recognition, and people generally think that people in certain universities are better, but I can tell you we have the talent base just like anywhere else, and I'll put up our colleagues against MIT and Harvard and Stanford any day, anytime. Our faculty are internationally recognized, and they are top-notch in their areas. They are solving problems that are important to Nebraska and having an impact internationally. And yet, many people both on and off campus are not aware of their accomplishments. And that's why we have these lectures twice a year to show off our brilliant faculty. Today is a great day to celebrate, and not just because of Halloween. Since 1993, Americans have been celebrating Art and Humanities Month in October. This month provides a unique opportunity for groups and individuals to educate, participate, and celebrate in their communities. In honor of this celebration, which includes today's lecture, we are pleased to release the request for proposals for the Arts and Humanities Research Enhancement Fund, only for UNL faculty. We encourage you to participate in this internal funding competition. To learn about it, please check up our website. Following Professor Hibbing's lecture, Kevin Smith, Professor of Political Science and a member of the Research Council, will moderate the question and answer session before we move to the reception in the Regency Suite across the hall. At this time, it is my honor to introduce our Chancellor, Harvey Perlman, who will introduce the speaker. So please join me in giving him a warm Husker welcome.
Every time I know I'm going to share a lectern with Prem, I take a double dose of blood pressure medicine. It's so exciting. Thank you, Prem. I echo Prem's remarks, and I too want to thank the Research Council for helping to recognize and celebrate outstanding research and creative activity here at the university. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Professor John Hibbing, Foundation Regents University Professor of Political Studies. Last year's fall Nebraska lecture delivered by Room of Energy was entitled Genes, Greens, and Disease. No one would dispute the link between genes and disease, but I'm sure there may be skeptics among you who might view the link between genes, behavior, and politics as being much more tenuous. Not so John Hibbing. Along with 2 colleagues, he studied the attitudes of about 8,000 sets of twins and discovered to his shock that some 53% of our political beliefs appear to come from genetic inheritance. Scientists have long known genes play a role in our personal and social temperaments, but Professor Hibbing is one of the first to explore how genetic affects our beliefs of how society should be organized, our political temperament. He and his colleagues are expanding this research to explore specific genes that may influence political behavior. Dr. Hibbing earned his bachelor's degree from Dana College in Nebraska and his master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Iowa. He joined UNL in 1981 as an assistant professor, was promoted to associate professor in 1985, and full professor in 1990. He has held the rank of Foundation Regents University Professor since 2001. His areas of expertise are American politics, especially legislative politics and public opinion, and most recently, biology and politics, especially evolutionary psychology. He is the author of several books, including co-authoring with fellow UNL political scientist Elizabeth Tice Morris, Congress as Public Enemy, and Stealth Democracy. He has edited the Legislative Studies Quarterly, served as president of the American Political Science Association's Legislative Studies section, and has received its Fenno Prize for Best Book in Legislative Studies. He has received 6 National Science Foundation grants, been a NATO Fellow in Science, and a Senior Fulbright Fellow. While some may have grown weary of the current election campaign, I know all of us are truly interested in hearing about genes, behavior, and politics. So in the spirit of the season, and in light of the fact that this is a lecture sponsored by the Chancellor, I must say, I'm Harvey Perlman, and I approve this lecture. Please welcome Professor John Hibbing.
University-wide lectures fell out of favor in the 1970s as the movement toward disciplinary specialization reached its zenith. But they made something of a comeback in the last 10 to 15 years. I'm pleased to say that they have, and I'm delighted that the University of Nebraska has been at the forefront of that movement. I've always thought this series to be an excellent idea, and when I was asked to give this year's talk, I thought it was an even better idea. Later, when I had to put the talk together, I thought it was a truly horrible idea. But now that the heavy lifting is over, I've decided that it's an excellent idea again. It really helped me to conceive of these ideas in terms that would be appropriate for a lay audience, as opposed to thinking about methods and details. It makes you think about the basics, and I think it was very edifying for me. So I don't know if this talk is going to be edifying for you, but it's already been helpful to me. Thanks to Chancellor Perlman, and thanks to Prem Paul for organizing this, and the Research Council, and thanks to all of you for coming. I know several of you had to rearrange work schedules, and many of you traveled long distances, and I appreciate that. As most of you know, the university's public relations efforts with regard to these talks is truly extraordinary. I found it a little unnerving to see my picture on flyers and posters all over campus, and I'm sure it was even more unnerving for many of you. I can only hope that this overexposure doesn't have the same kind of backlash that the Nelson Ricketts ads probably will have. When real scientists present these talks, they show a picture of their lab and the personnel associated with the lab. But I'm a social scientist pretending to be a scientist, so I don't have a lab. I don't have postdocs. What I do have, though, is an administration that has been nothing but supportive of the research that I do, which is non-traditional, somewhat controversial, and very risky to fund, and wildly interdisciplinary. So I very much appreciate that. And I also appreciate the fact that I do have a team. We might not call it a lab, but I have a very interdisciplinary team. I'll introduce you to some of them as I go through the talk, and you'll meet one when the question and answer takes place. But before I do that, before I get to the talk and the introductions of those individuals, I do want to say that I need to acknowledge the biologists on campus who have been very patient with me as I kind of retool on the run. Conversations with Al Camel and classes with Penny Worthington, Dan Ledger, and Larry Harshman have been absolutely crucial. And I really appreciate their efforts in helping a non-traditional student. They've been very patient. And I can tell you with some confidence that this old canard that scientists are bad teachers is completely untrue. Okay, well, I wish I had more time to suck up to people, but I have a great deal to cover, and I'm going to go way too fast, but I hope this will at least give you a flavor for some of the things that we have done and will be doing. For those of you, am I mobile? Is the mic still on? Okay, good. For those of you who like a kind of a guideline to where we're going to go, I will start with a discussion of statistics and twins. We'll move to genetics and biology, then get to the main event, politics and personality, before I promise you a very brief conclusion. Most people recognize that there are pretty big differences between individuals with regard to physical traits. It's not simply the fact that Andre the Giant ate more than the actor Wallace Shawn that led him to be 4 times as heavy. There's a genetic basis for this, and that's not very controversial. But could it really be the case that our behaviors, our attitudes, our predispositions, even our political beliefs may have some basis in genetics? This is a much more difficult concept to accept, and I perfectly understand why people are somewhat incredulous about these things. Could it be that James Carville, the Ragin' Cajun, is a firebrand liberal, partially because of his genetic structure, and that Bob Novak, the self-described Prince of Darkness, is a staunch conservative because of his genetics? Well, let's play with this idea and see what the evidence suggests. As Chancellor Perlman mentioned, a little over a year ago, 2 colleagues and I published this article in the American Political Science Review. It got a little more attention than most articles in the American Political Science Review get, largely because the New York Times ran a story on it, which was then picked up by a variety of other news outlets. So we were the flavor of the week. And I say that not in a bragging way, because much of the reaction was negative. People thought this was silliness. But it did get a lot of attention. It's supposedly the most downloaded article in the history of political science, largely because it moved beyond the realm of academia. And the reactions were wide. And what we claimed was that there was indeed a genetic basis for this, not that genetics determines politics, but that it is relevant. Let's see how this could be. The evidence in the article was based on the twin design, which is a workhorse for behavioral genetics. The twin design works not because of the existence of twins, but because of the existence of 2 very different types of twins. First, we have dizygotic twins, which many of you refer to as fraternal twins. This happens when one sperm fertilizes one egg, a second sperm fertilizes a completely separate egg, and the mother has, in essence, 2 separate pregnancies simultaneously. As a result, the zygotes share 50% genetic inheritance, just the way any other full siblings would. This is quite different than a monozygotic twin. What happens here is that one sperm fertilizes one egg. You have a single zygote for several minutes, perhaps an hour or 2, and then the zygote splits into 2 separate zygotes, thus the name monozygotic, because at one point they were indeed monozygotic. Not surprisingly then, these 2 zygotes share 100% of the genetic heritage with each other. So it's this difference between 50% genetic heritage and 100% that it gives us some leverage in ascertaining whether or not genes may be involved in a variety of things that I'll talk about shortly. Well, what do we do with this then? What you do is you identify any trait you want. It might be breast cancer, it might be schizophrenia, it might be extroversion. In this case, it could be a political attitude, such as your attitude towards school prayer. You find a large sample of twins and you identify their preferences or their condition on whatever trait interests you. And then you compare the correlation of monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins, which I'm abbreviating MZ and DZ. A correlation is simply an indication of whether the condition of one twin will help you predict the condition of another twin. So the higher that correlation gets, it can go all the way up to 1.0, then the more similar those twins are. So here we see that MZ twins are indeed more similar with regard to attitudes on school prayer than DZ twins. What happens to compute the heritability estimate is that you double the difference. So we have a difference of 0.21, double that to 0.42. Why do you double it? Well, because the difference between 50% and 100% is double. So since we have 50% inheritance for DZ twins, 100 for MZ, we double it, get an estimate of 0.42. The remainder is attributed to the environment. This is very important. Nobody's saying that only the genetics matter here. In fact, if this is to be believed, it looks like a little more environmental effect is going on with regard to school prayer than genetics. But the surprising thing to a lot of people is that there is a genetic basis for that. Here's the main table from the article. I'm just isolating 2 main concepts. Instead of just looking at school prayer, we had a 28-item conservative index, a variety of questions all designed to get at whether or not people were political conservatives or political liberals, with some social kind of attitudes thrown in. Let's see, I think I have a pointer. Here you see that we have a 0.65 for the MZ twins, 0.43 for the DZ twins, difference of 0.22, double that, you got a 0.44 estimate for heritability. The remainder goes to the environment. You can partition the environment into shared and unshared. I don't have enough time to talk about that, but shared is primarily parental influence. Unshared would be things that happen elsewhere that are still environmental. One of the things that drew a lot of attention from this article is the contrast of party affiliation. Here you see that only 0.14 of party affiliation, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, is based on genetics. And whereas for political ideology, your views, that was a much higher 0.44. This is very similar to findings with regard to religion. Whether or not you're a Presbyterian or a Methodist or a Catholic is almost entirely environmental. There is no gene for that kind of thing. And the same with regard to party. Whether you're Democrat, Republican, that's environmental. Your parents are very influential there and the rest of your environment. But when you get to actual beliefs, do you believe in an afterlife? Do you believe in keeping the Sabbath holy? How often do you go to church? Those kinds of things in religion and those kinds of political views on actual issues with regard to politics, that's where we see a genetic component coming in. Well, I'm not going to defend the twin design at length. There are better places to do that, but I am going to mention one concern that a lot of people have with the twin design, which probably is playing around in many of your minds, and that's the equal environment assumption. Is it the case that we can assign all the difference in variability and correlation from MZs to DZs to the environment? Might it not be that MZ twins are treated much more similarly than DZ twins, that their parents dress them in the same outfits and treat them more similarly than they would otherwise? If that's the case, we've got an overestimate of heritability. So I'm going to mention three areas, I'm going to do this very briefly, where we can see that that's probably not the case. First, misidentification of twin zygosity, assortative mating, and genes shaping our environment. You might think that there are only two kinds of twins. MZ twins believed to be MZ twins, and DZ twins believed to be DZ twins. Well, that's not the case. I put these particular twin pairs up because I wanted to be tricky. I thought you might think that the twins on the left were DZ and the twins on the right were MZ. In truth, they're both DZ twins. They're both dizygotic twins. They both share just 50% genetic heritability. Now, I don't know if the parents of the twins on the right thought that they were MZ twins or not. But the truth of the matter is many twins do misidentify the zygosity of their twins. In some studies, up to 35% of parents think they have DZs and they really have MZs, or vice versa. So this means we've got four groups that are of some interest. We can look at MZ twins believed to be MZs, MZs believed to be DZs, and then DZs who are correctly identified by their parents and those who aren't. If the environmental types are right, then there should be a big difference between the top two and then also a big difference between the bottom two, because what matters is what these people are believed to be, not what they really are. So here we got MZ twins, but everybody in the world thinks they're DZ twins. If the environment is playing a big role, there should be a big difference between these two. We find that's not the case, though. There's absolutely no statistical difference in MZ twins believed to be DZs and MZs believed to be MZs, similarly for DZs. And the big difference comes not with regard to what the world believes they are, but what they actually are. Another interesting aspect that provides some justification, I think, for the equal environment assumption, and actually suggests it might be conservative, is spousal concordance, what we call assortative mating. Do you marry people who are like you? Do you marry an individual like you? With regard to personality traits, such as impulsivity, extroversion, and neuroticism, we see that that's really not the case. These correlations are minuscule. You have to go out to 3 decimal points in 2 places to get anything, and they're not statistically significant. An extrovert is as likely to marry an introvert as another extrovert. This is not the case with regard to politics, however. Conservatism, we see a very strong correlation of 0.65. This is about as strong as it was for identical twins, which is really remarkable. So, and it's not the case that you go around giving your prospective spouses a quiz about politics, but it is the case that you just seem to eventually be attracted to people who are fairly similar to you. Some people say, well, it must be assimilation. Maybe you just grow to be similar over the course of a long marriage. That's not true. If you look at the data, you are as similar to your spouse when you're first married as you are when you've been married for 30 years. As someone who's been married to a strong political person for many years, I can say that there's no way I could assimilate her. So this is much more assortation than assimilation. Well, why is this relevant? Well, what it means is this assumption that DZs share 50% genetic heritage is wrong. Since both their parents are similar with regard to the political genetic structure, I'm going to just conservatively estimate it's 60%. It's actually much more than that. And that means if we recompute this, we'd end up with a heritability estimate of about 0.58 rather than 0.42. So if anything, the equal environment assumption is a conservative estimate of what's going on. Maybe more interestingly, let's think about the possibility that genetics, which in the twin design is basically estimated as a separate effect, just as the environment is, maybe genetics actually is influencing the environment. How could this be? Well, think of somebody who might be musically gifted. This person may spend a lot of time in the conservatory. Well, okay, so then they do well and make a name for themselves in music. Is that because they spend all the time in the conservatory, or might that existence in the conservatory be due to some genetic influences in the first place? This is what we're talking about here, if there might not be an overlap. This is something that's very difficult to test, but there are ways of doing it. One way you can do it is to think of some trait. I usually stay away from cognitive ability because it's very dangerous, and I'm getting in enough trouble as it is. But this example is too good to pass up. So let's think of a child's cognitive ability. We can compare the influence of the environment for children who are non-adoptive, because there we can indeed have a link between genetics and the environment, because your genetic parents are creating the environment for you. When we have an adoptive situation, however, that link doesn't apply, because your environment is being shaped by someone who is not genetically related to you. So if we see that this link between the environment and cognitive ability is weaker for adoptive children than it is for non-adoptive children, we'll have strong evidence that genetics is actually working, not just directly, but also indirectly through the environment. So here's a neat correlation between the home environment assessed at age 2. There's something called HOME, which is a fairly objective way of assessing the environment. Go there and count the number of books in the home and observe the interaction between the child and parent. And then they did an IQ test on the child when the child was 7, 5 years after the home environment assessment was made. And for non-adoptive children, there's a correlation of about 0.31. So the environment is fairly influential, but not determinative, as you might expect. For adoptive children, however, we see a correlation that's much lower, which really doesn't make any sense unless you buy the explanation I gave you, that there's this indirect effect of genetics coming through the environment. Why would the environment of an adoptive child be less influential on the IQ of that child than it would be for a non-adoptive child? So I think that indirect effect is certainly there. Maybe it's easier to see with regard to a direct correlation of IQ. Let's just look at the parent's IQ and the child's IQ over the course of from 3 to age 16. For non-adoptive children, you see that this goes up nicely, a correlation of about 0.3, just a little bit over. So certainly it matters how intelligent parents are. What do you think this is going to look like for adoptive children? Maybe just a little bit lower? I mean, after all, these children are still being raised by their parents. Well, it's a little bit lower, all right. It's nothing. By age 12, there is zero correlation between the IQ of the parent and the IQ of the child. So I think it's very difficult to look at these data and say it's all environment. The real problem with twin studies is not this equal environment assumption. It's the fact that they give no indication of the biology of this. How does this work? How can we get from genes to these kinds of behaviors and traits? And also, it leaves the impression that genes in the environment work separately. You end up with this coefficient of 0.42. It's misleading both in terms of its specificity and the fact that it's isolated from the environmental effects. So to understand this, we need to get into the biology just a little bit, and I'll try to make this as painless as possible. Well, here we are, or at least here the males in the audience are. We know that this is a male because we have an X and a Y chromosome. If it was a female, there'd be 2 X's right there. What are these chromosomes, though? Well, here you see it blown up a little bit. You can see that it's a rat's nest of DNA tightly coiled, wrapped around histones. Let's keep blowing this up a little bit more and look at a larger DNA. And here you see the nucleotides, the A's, T's, C's, and G's that hopefully you all learned about in high school biology. You could string these nucleotides out, and we know that they go together in triplets to form amino acids. These amino acids then go together to form proteins. Sometimes it takes thousands of amino acids to form a protein. These proteins are important because, and this is what I'll focus on today since we're interested in behavior, they create neurotransmitters, but they also transmit these neurotransmitters and receive them. If a neurotransmitter is going to be received by the key part of the brain, the protein has to be there. Protein has a shape, and the neurotransmitter has to be able to fit in that. So we need to be cognizant of all these 3 components, the creation, the transmission, and the reception of neurotransmitters. Some that are crucial are dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and vasopressin. I'll mention a couple of them today. Before I do, though, we need to talk a little bit more about this DNA structure. I need to remind you that a lot of us are completely identical for many segments of the genome. And this is because all of us have a central nervous system, a small intestine, most of us have toenails, things like that. And these are the same for all of us. But we also have these polymorphisms. And what happens here is that you might have an A and I might have a T. in a certain area of our genetic structure. We call this a single nucleotide polymorphism. Another polymorphism is called a variable number tandem repeat. And this is where instead of having just one TAG, we have 3. Not surprisingly, this would be called the long version, or the long allele of a gene, and the other one would be a short version. So these are important. These polymorphisms are because they give us variation. And since we have tremendous variation in behavior and in politics, if the genes are going to be relevant, we have to have variation, and polymorphisms give them to us. What happens then is that at a certain spot in the genome, we have what's called a protein coding region. Starting right there, this RNA is going to come and glom onto it and start transcribing it. And this is what's necessary for it to eventually become a protein. What I want to focus on today, though, is the region that comes upstream from the protein coding gene. Here we see, for starters, the promoter region. For this RNA to come, there have to be a lot of things happen. It has to be encouraged. There are activator proteins, enzymes, a variety of things that will attract this RNA and get it to start. And a lot of this is going to be relevant to behavior, because it's not, these protein coding regions will do the same thing, but they may do it at different times. There may be a noisy sound right now that scares all of us, but some of us have a full-fledged panic attack and others don't. A lot of that may be due to variations in the promoter region. Maybe your adrenal system just did not kick off, but mine's highly sensitive. I've got a hair trigger, so I'm going crazy about this. So these promoter regions have a lot to do with behavior. A lot of what's going on in biology now is moved beyond the protein coding regions, which always start by the number 1, by the way, and then as you move left, the numbers get larger in a negative fashion. Much of the stuff that I'm going to be concerned with will be involved with the promoter and other intergenic regions. Well, now you know enough to follow this example, which I think should drive it home a little bit better. We're going to talk about a promoter region of serotonin transport. And serotonin is an important neurotransmitter with regard to feeling confident about yourself, being in a leadership capacity, or conversely not feeling so good about yourself. In mice, they noticed that there were long alleles and short alleles in this promoter region, and that those mice with shorter alleles tend to be less confident and more depressed. If a strange object was placed in their cage, they tended to cower in the corner. Well, people wondered if the same thing might not be going on in humans. Might we be influenced to be confident or depressed, depending on whether or not we have a long allele or a short allele? That didn't turn out to be the case when they looked at the direct effects. But then Avshalom Caspi conducted a fascinating story. He started off looking, he had, by the way, the long-term health histories of 1,000 New Zealanders. He found that sure enough, whether or not you were mistreated as a child was a big explainer of how depressed you were as an adult. So on the y-axis, we have probability of a depressive episode. This would be considering suicide, being institutionalized, losing work. It's pretty serious stuff. And you see a nice positive relationship between whether or not you were not mistreated as a child or had severe mistreatment. This is what you would expect. Where it gets interesting, though, is to find out that different people have different sensitivities to these environmental influences. Well, what do you think might be the difference between and among these 3 types of people? You probably can guess. It's genetic. Those people who are highly sensitive to whether or not they were mistreated as children tend to be SS, homozygous short, for the promoter region of 5-HTT. Heterozygous individuals are right in the middle, and those people who are homozygous long are amazingly oblivious to these environmental influences. So for LLs, whether you were severely mistreated or not mistreated at all doesn't give you any compass on whether or not you're going to be depressed as an adult. So there's a big change in the amount of resiliency that these individuals have. I told you I was going to introduce a few of the people in my research team. One I want to talk about is Kim Espy, who I know is here today. She's Associate Vice Chancellor in Prem's office, and this is a bastardization of Kim's research, but I thought it was similar enough to give you an idea. Kim is interested in mothers who have used drugs during pregnancy, or those who have not, and the effect this has on children. Well, the empirical observation is that, especially with regard to executive function, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, you see a big difference in the resiliency of individuals. Some children are completely ravaged by mothers who engage in this kind of behavior during pregnancy, and others are amazingly oblivious to it. Why is that? Well, Kim thinks it's probably genetic. She hasn't found a cute little SS/LL to figure out what's going on there, but she will eventually find the genetic basis for this. One final biological note, and this involves vasopressin, shift neurotransmitters, just a little bit now. But here we also are in this region I talked about. Here's a protein coding region of the gene. It's got 2 exons and an intron in the middle. This codes for AVPR1A. It's a vasopressin receptor. Vasopressin is a neurotransmitter that's been found to be relevant in pair bonding and also in offspring tending. So, and you need to have vasopressin, you also need to have a receptor. What's interesting here is they found this microsatellite, which is about 500 base pairs upstream. It's not exactly a promoter region that turns it off and on, but it does seem to be relevant to that. The longer this microsatellite is, and here you can see it's highly polymorphic, the longer that is, the more vasopressin receptors you have. So this leads to the following relationship. Your length of the microsatellite affects the number of vasopressin receptors. The more vasopressin receptors you have, the more caring parent you're going to be. This relationship applies very nicely across species. We see it in prairie voles, which are cute little mammals. We see it in bonobos, and we see it in Homo sapiens. All these three have very long microsatellites in the AVPR1A flanking region, and they also are very good parents relative to other species. This is the opposite of what you find with montane voles and chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are horrible fathers and love them or leave them mates. And montane voles, this is really where the research got started because you couldn't tell the difference between a montane vole and a prairie vole by looking at them. But it turns out that montane voles have very different behaviors. They too are bad fathers and really not devoted mates. So what's the difference? Well, these individuals, these species rather, have short alleles, and this leads to a lot of suspicion that maybe the AVPR1A gene is relevant to this. It also holds up within species. I told you that these prairie voles were very good parents, but they're not all good parents. There is variation, and there is a direct correlation between the length of this microsatellite and how caring the fathers are, how much time they spend with their offspring. I think this is probably going to hold up with humans as well, but that's going to be explosive research. All right, let's get to the main event, which is politics. I think to really get started here, you have to appreciate that there is more than just personality, and that I think we need to view the human condition in three separate components: personal temperament, social temperament, and political temperament. How would we measure these things? Well, we know a lot about personal temperament already. A lot of this is done with surveys. You can ask people questions such as, do you like riding roller coasters? Do you like the thrill? Do you like the fun? Do you like the speed? That's a common item with regard to personal temperament. Social temperament is different. Here we have to have two different people involved, at least two. Behavioral economists these days are very fond of doing experimental games where they actually do this. They don't just say, how would you handle it if you were given $20? They give somebody $20 and see how they would divide it. Or if somebody who divides it unfairly with them, they see if they would punish that person. It's really quite fascinating. So here we're interested in whether or not you would share some of your money with a nearby person who was not given anything. So it's a one-on-one relationship, and it's a very social one. Politics is different, though. And here I think one example of an item that would measure political temperament is, does society work best when rule breakers are punished? Now here the issue is not whether I would share money with somebody, not whether I would punish somebody who is right in my face, but do I think this is an appropriate rule for society? Do I think this is the way group life should be organized? That, to me, is what distinguishes politics from either sociality or personal temperament. Personal temperament could be individual. You can ride a roller coaster by yourself. Social requires one other individual, but political, this is something that we're setting up for all of society. Well, our level of knowledge is very different across these three. With regard to personal temperament, psychologists have made a lot of headway. We've seen some of this research already this afternoon. I told you about 5-HTT, relevance to depression and assertiveness. DRD4, this is a dopamine receptor, a certain class of dopamine receptors, which has been connected to risk-taking behavior in human beings and also connected to ADHD. I mentioned this third one, reading disorders, because this gives me a chance to mention an additional member of my team, Shelley Smith, who is a human geneticist at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, has been one of the leaders really in identifying the genes, many of them on chromosome 6, that are relevant to dyslexia and other reading disorders. Social temperament, though, we know a little bit less. I mentioned the vasopressin research, and we still haven't made the specific connection from genes to behavior in humans, but that's going to happen very quickly. Oxytocin, we know that oxytocin, which is another neurotransmitter, increases cooperation. And we also have a very good map of the oxytocin system, both receptors and production and transport. So it's only a matter of time before we get from the actual genes to the cooperation, but it hasn't been done yet. Political temperament is another story. There's no specific genetic alleles that have been connected to political traits, and this is our group's main goal. Because, to be honest with you, many people view the twin studies that I described as kind of a cheap parlor trick. And I think what we need to do next is show, here is a genetic allele, and here is a behavior, and there is a connection. I think we'll be much more likely to do this with regard to a set of traits that I call personality-relevant political traits. So here I want you to not jump too quickly to the liberal-conservative thing. Let's think about politics from a different level, and that's just that some people are very intense about politics. They're willing to discuss politics in the open, and they're willing to argue about it. Other people aren't, regardless of whether they're liberal or conservative. And I think these kinds of traits we have a shot of finding. We already talked about 5-HTT, serotonin. This is assertiveness. You have to be fairly assertive if you're willing to talk about politics in public with somebody who disagrees with you. DRD4 may be the same way. Feeling intensely about politics. I think this is going to be really interesting. What we'd like to do is to ask people this set of questions. We've actually got this set of questions, or a parallel set of questions in about a dozen different issues, but let's just look at the death penalty. We want to ask people, if someone murdered you, would you want that person to be put to death? But we also want to ask, if someone murdered a close acquaintance, would you want that person to be put to death? And, most politically, do you want the death penalty to be available as punishment for murderers? This is the political aspect of the question. We want to see why some people are really involved with this kind of question. Other people, they don't really get intense about things unless it affects them directly or someone very close to them. I always think of Ronald Reagan here, who was a master, I think, of bringing politics to the personal level. He was really the first one who, at the State of the Union address, would not just say, I'm going to cut your taxes. He would say, when I cut your taxes, Grandma Jones up there is going to have a better life. And she'd stand up and wave, and everybody would say, okay, I got it. You know, that's a person. So this is easy to do. This is more difficult, and not everybody does it. Not everybody really resonates with politics in the abstract. What we'll be doing down at the Baylor Medical Center in Houston is to brain scan people while they're answering those questions that I just showed you. So unfortunately, these brain scans aren't of those questions, but they do represent what we think we're likely to find. Here you see somebody who's not really that into it, whatever is being done in this case. We're going to say it's about politics. Ignore the green lines, by the way, and the blue dot. That's just a basis for the scan. What you need to know is that red means an activation of the brain in that area. Yellow means a very intense activation. So here this individual is not thinking very hard about these things. His brain is not being energized by it. Here you see a lot of activity in the limbic portion of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, the anterior insula. This is the emotional part of the brain. When the emotions get involved, then you're going to have the prefrontal cortex get involved to actually kind of resolve a conflict. You've got the parietal cortex making these things in both cases, but now we've got emotion, so we have to balance that out. The thing is, we're going to be interested in the kinds of people who have a very emotional reaction to politics and those who don't. And we think we'll be able to predict who's going to be involved in politics in the real world simply by looking at these brain scans. So it may be, and liberals and conservatives tend not to like to hear this, but it may be that there are a fair number of similarities between James Carville and Bob Novak, in the sense that they're both very intense about politics. They do it for a living, my God. And they are certainly willing to argue about politics in public. So there are going to be a lot of these personality-relevant traits that I think are not liberal-conservative, but simply differentiate between people who are politically inert and politically active. But now we get to the tougher part, the non-personality-relevant traits. Remember those original findings from the twin study were that there were differences between liberals and conservatives with regard to genetics. This, I think, is going to be much more difficult to find because there really is a difference between personality and politics. We know that genes are strongly related to personality. This is the big five personality array that psychologists use so much. And we see that all of these are very strongly heritable. There's a genetic component to that. But guess what? There really isn't much of a connection between those personalities and politics. Liberals don't like to hear this, but conservatives are not more disagreeable than liberals. Conservatives don't like to hear this, but liberals are not more neurotic than conservatives. There's very little. NS, by the way, means non-significant. I should point that out to you. So there's just not much there. There is something with regard to openness. Liberals are more open to new experiences than conservatives. It's a fairly weak relationship, but it's there. And also, before you liberals start feeling too superior, I should tell you that 3 of the central measures of openness in this case were, are you fresh to your parents? Do you frequently break society's rules? And would you take dangerous drugs because you were curious about what it would do? So there's openness and there's openness. But it's a fairly weak set of relationships. The same with regard to those social conditions that I told you about. Liberals are not more generous in one-on-one interaction than conservatives. And conservatives are not more punitive. You might expect, I think a lot of people would expect that conservatives are going to be much more punitive, and that just is not there. There is a fairly big differentiation between personality traits, social traits, and political traits. So how are we going to measure politics then? Unfortunately, this is the way it's usually done, with what I call issues of the day. People ask questions such as I showed you before on school prayer. Do you approve or disapprove? Federal housing. One of the criticisms of our paper that I thought was the most unfair was that this is crazy. How could there be a gene for federal housing? That's right, but we don't think there is. What we do think is that if you go deeper to what we call core socio-political orientations, this is where you have a chance of finding something. Let me just work through 4 or 5 examples of the questions we have in mind. And here, notice again, this is the political aspect of it. We ask people, society works best when people live according to traditional values or people adjust values to changing times. Another one. Society works best when those who break rules are always punished or those who break rules are forgiven. Society works best when people realize all knowledge comes from God or people constantly strive to discover things on their own. We take care of those in our group first, or we realize that people everywhere should be helped equally. And finally, people realize humans are irreparably flawed, or people realize humans can be improved with effort. Now, I don't know if answers to these questions are genetic. I suspect that they are, but I don't have evidence of that. What I do have evidence of is that they really clump together. There's a very definite division between 2 groups. You have one that I call the absolutists, and I think we need to work on a better name for these, but for now, I think this will do. These people tend to believe that human nature is fundamentally flawed. They're very wary of outgroups. They yearn for in-group unity. A lot of this makes sense given that you start from the belief that human nature is dangerous and flawed. They believe that behavior should conform to timeless moral codes, and they have a preference for in-group leaders who possess certainty and clarity. Contrast that with contextualists. Humans can be changed for the better. They're open to outgroups. They're suspicious, actually, of in-group unity rather than yearning for it. They believe behavioral standards must be flexible, and that they have a preference for in-group leaders who are malleable and open. Now, a lot of you are thinking liberal and conservative, which is certainly not wrong, but I do think it's important to go beyond that. These kinds of attitudes affect religion, they affect your attitude toward education, toward art, and a variety of other things. So it's partly political, but partly deeper than that. It's an orientation to life. One of the questions I get asked about most is whether or not these possible genetic links could explain the political divisiveness that bothers so many of you, which appears to be rampant in the country today. I don't know. Let's think about how it might work. And it's a little bit of a stretch. This is, by the way, is pure speculation now, but I think we're toward the end of the talk, and you're entitled to that. So let's see if we can figure out why we have what appears to be a big bimodal distribution, with a lot of people, at least who are active in politics, being extremely liberal and others being extremely conservative and fighting like crazy. Well, from a genetic point of view, this would work if a trait like politics were monogenic. That means just one gene involved. This is what you have with regard to eye color. It's essentially a monogenic trait. Or to go back to Mendel, the color of sweet peas, or whether they're wrinkled or smooth. So brown eyes is a haplosufficient trait. That means they just need to have one of the genes that would be that way, brown eyes. So this hump is a little bit lower, but it's definitely one or the other. You have a few greens and grays, but for the most part, we have a bimodal distribution. If you have a polygenic trait, such as height, many genes are involved with height, and therefore, the more genes you have, the more likely you are to have this nice normal distribution. Most people are middling in height, a very few number of short people, a very few number of really, really tall people. Well, one would think that politics would be polygenic, if it's going to be anything. It's a very complicated social trait, all kinds of things going on, so you would think that many traits would be there and that it would probably be a normal distribution. That may be the case, but the way you could get around this, remember assortative mating. This is a very important thing. One of the things I learned in Larry Harshman's genetics class was the power of random mating, and that also means that if you don't have random mating, it's very powerful. So you're going to have a big fattening of the tails here. This is a lot bigger tail because you've got liberals marrying liberals and conservatives marrying conservatives. But you still got a hump, and I think the way you'd need to get rid of that is to get rid of those people who are not motivated by politics. If you only look at those individuals who strongly care about politics, then you do see a bimodal distribution. So I think we are probably facing a situation where you've got one set of genes that are involved with whether or not people are politically oriented and politically intense, and another set that maybe tilts us one way toward the liberal or conservative side. Once again, though, this is quite a bit of speculation. Can genetics explain the increase in political divisiveness? A lot of people want this to be true. But I think we might want it too much. That is, I think we might overstate the extent to which we have divisiveness today that is greater than we had divisiveness in the past. This is a shot of Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, just before Burr shot Hamilton. We've had this kind of divisiveness for a long time. It might be greater today, I don't know, but you do need to keep some historical context about this. People have been fighting and getting very intense about politics for a long, long time. It may be that we have more assortative mating these days. After all, we get to know each other better before we get married, and it used to be the case that females were discouraged from expressing any kind of political beliefs, so you really wouldn't know what you were getting. Some people have made the case that we have more assortative mating. For me, it's more likely that we just have these ebbs and flows in society, and sometimes we have political divisions that map onto this absolutist contextualist divide that I've been describing. And I think we certainly have this today with issues like immigration, which is clearly an in-group, out-group kind of issue, social issues, which tie into our concerns for timeless moral codes, and the war in Iraq and the battle against terrorism. We see a clear division, I think, between one side that has good and evil, and we must defeat evil, in a way that appears childish to people on the contextualist side of things, and perhaps dangerous. Equally, though, on the other side, you have people who can't understand how liberals could be so malleable and flexible and spineless. How this is dangerous to have this kind of variation. A contextualist might say, well, the context of the vote changed, and that's why one vote was positive and one was negative. But that doesn't wash with another group of people. So I think we have a very distinct approach to politics and religion. I think you really can't separate religion because it's part of this worldview. And I think the fact that now we are in this period of time in which politics divides in a similar way to the absolutist contextualist split is why it appears as though we have much more division than we thought we would like to have. Now, I know this is going to take me a little bit over, Prim, but I'm pretty sure that the first question I would get would be this one. So let me conclude by addressing this issue about the relevance of genetics to behavior and whether or not this is too dangerous to talk about. After our article appeared, we actually received several pieces of hate mail. And for the most part, they weren't saying we were wrong. They were saying you shouldn't be talking about this. This is better left unsaid. So, as you might judge from the picture that I selected for this, I think this is wrong. And I'm going to try to tell you why. I don't think it's nearly as dangerous as you might imagine. If the notion is that somehow people who believe genetics are relevant will be less tolerant, I think that's probably untrue. Think of the gay rights issue these days. Which side is it that seems to be more tolerant? Is it the side that says it's all environmental, it's just the choice of the gay individual? Or is it the side that thinks that maybe there's a genetic component to this? This gay fellow is wearing a t-shirt called XQ28. This was at one time believed to be the gay gene. It was later proved not to be, but they're focusing on a different set of genes now, especially those relevant to the third interstitial region of the hippocampus. So they're going to find the gay gene fairly soon. And the question is, does that mean people are going to be less tolerant toward gays? As I said, most of the division right now is that those people who are more tolerant toward gays are the ones, especially the gay community, saying that there is a biological basis for this. So I don't think we can draw the conclusion that a partial role for genetics is somehow going to lead us to be less tolerant. Remember, genetics is very flexible. It's not dichotomous. I'm not going to go through all this, but a lot of people are talking about epigenetics. It's not even just the nucleotides anymore. These histones, the proteins that surround the DNA have a big influence on who we are. And these things are heavily shaped by the environment, by what you eat. Been some very recent articles about this. Schizophrenics. There are marks on the non-DNA aspect of this that seem to be influential in whether these genes are activated or not. So this is a very exciting era, and it's not your father's biology where you just said, here are the nucleotides, here's the protein coding region, and we don't need to talk about anything else. This epigenetic, that is non-nucleotide sequence, is crucial. Similarly, and this is getting to my final point, the intergenic DNA, we talked about this already, that it's not just in the protein coding regions. All this is really the deep space of the DNA, and a lot of this decoding of the genome is really just the protein coding genes. And this is the exciting part here, I think, from a behavioral point of view. Genetics is not determinism. This is the way I'd like to conclude. That's something called incomplete penetrance, which means you might have a gene for this and it just doesn't express itself. This happens frequently. So don't think of this as if you have a gene for something that it's going to work this way. And anyway, there aren't genes for this or for that. There are genes that interact with the environment. They express themselves differently. Your dog may have a gene for brown spots. Another dog may have the identical gene, but the brown will be a different shade. The expression is different with genes. And please remember that this is all probabilistic. There's something about the word genes which short-circuits people's ability to think probabilistically. They think it's got to be this way, that you're born with blue eyes or brown eyes and you live the rest of your life like that, and nothing can change it. It just doesn't work that way. If we do find that there is a variation in time spent with children on the basis of whether you have the long form or short form of that microsatellite, bear in mind that you still have this group of people right here. And what this means is here's somebody with the short form of that vasopressin gene, and they actually are spending more time with their children than people with a long form. There's a tremendous amount of overlap. So if you were deeply in love with someone who had the short form of a vasopressin microsatellite, I wouldn't call off the engagement. There are a lot more things going on here. I wanted to read my last paragraph because I don't want to misstate anything. Some people will use genetics as a justification for intolerance. I'm not naive. But if deprived of this excuse, these individuals would merely switch to environmental reasoning. The problem is not knowledge, but what we do with it. Are Homo sapiens so fragile that we can only be respectful of others if we believe the fairy tale that all people are genetically identical? Will we treat the dyslexic, the homeless, the autistic, the homosexual, the politically liberal, or the politically conservative less compassionately as a result of the fact that part of the reason for their condition is genetic? We just need to accept that genes matter, but resist the urge to label every genotype as better or worse than others. Scientific illiteracy is not a prerequisite for empathy or for idealism. Knowledge may be dangerous, but ignorance is perilous, and willful ignorance is unforgivable. Thank you.
My name is Kevin Smith. I talk fresh to my parents, and I do have the short form of the vasopressin microsatellite, so don't give me any aggravation. In addition to those floors, I'm a colleague of John's in the political science department. I'm going to be in charge of moderating the Q&A, but before we get to that, I would like to thank John one more time for a very intellectually stimulating and exciting talk. So one more round of applause for John. At this time, there is an opportunity to direct questions towards John, and I'm sure John will field those questions really well. If I could, if you have a question, could you make your way to the single microphone? The reason we're asking people to do that is because it's being webcast, and if you don't speak into the microphone, it'll look like John's responding to silence, which he often does. Please, sir, go ahead.
This is a little awkwardly put question. It's a kind of correlation of a correlation. Does the correlation among twins of their political views itself correlate with other characteristics of a pair of twins, such as intelligence? Is that clear?
Well, inheritance is heritable, and political beliefs are heritable. The overlap between those two is questionable. I mean, I don't think we'd want to jump to that conclusion that therefore it's somehow operating through the same biological substrate. But you're definitely right that intelligence is inherited as well as political beliefs.
That wasn't my point. If you look at the correlation of political beliefs for various sets of twins, is there a stronger correlation, for example, for intelligence pairs of twins
Oh.
rather than non-intelligent?
Well, I suspect there is, in the sense that I've only looked at that with regard to those who have strong political beliefs and weak political beliefs. And there does tend to be a correlation between intelligence and that. People who are intelligent tend to be stronger, more motivated by politics. So I think, I haven't looked at that directly, but indirectly, given that evidence about the intensity of political beliefs, I think that's probably true. That makes sense to some extent because if you're looking at political variation, you have more of it when people feel intensely about it. Those people who don't have so much politics in their blood, so to speak, would not have the same variation. And to get these correlations strong, you need strong variation.
Other questions for John? Well, I will invoke my right as the person moderating the Q&A then to ask a question that I'm sure that is going to drop John right into it. John, you're talking about these genetic bases of political behavior and how they are variable within a population. Is it possible that you can see variation between populations? In other words, people would have different political predispositions across populations.
I thought you were my friend, Kevin. This is...
It's the short form of the vasopressin microsatellite.
Yeah, I was hoping not to talk about this today, but there are differences across groups. The DRD4, the dopamine receptor one, has received a lot of attention, and there is clear variation between those with a longer version, a longer allele of DRD4, and those with a shorter version. And we're not sure what explains these variations. In East Asia, the longer version is virtually non-existent. In South America, the long version of DRD4 is really quite common. I have no conclusions to draw from that, but it would be surprising if it didn't happen. This is part of the things that we're going to need to recognize and deal with as a society. When you have separate breeding populations for extended periods of time, you're going to get differences. And that may be evil. We may wish it weren't the case, but it is the case. The causal order, though, is something that we certainly haven't worked out, and any potential implications for that. Question over there.
Are you familiar with the work that Robert Altemeyer has done in Canada? With,
authoritarian personality?
Yeah, right-wing authoritarian personalities. And how does that figure into?
No, that's a good question. Yeah, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, there's been a lot of concern about the relationship between personality and political beliefs, especially with regard to this authoritarianism. Adorno started it right after World War II. Is there a special personality that would lead you to kind of some of these absolutist traits? And it does work out. There is a correlation between authoritarianism and absolutism. I think part of the problem, though, is that the reason psychologists aren't too keen on authoritarianism is it's not a true personality trait. A lot of the items used in the authoritarianism scale, the F test, are really political beliefs. And so you're kind of correlating political beliefs with political beliefs. And in that sense, I think we still need to see these deeper political personality traits, such as neuroticism and extroversion, as kind of the baseline. And those traits don't seem to have much to do with politics. But you're certainly right. Social dominance is another one, authoritarianism. Those are related to politics. Whether they're really different than politics is the question.
John, excellent presentation. You talked about that when you published the paper, your colleagues attacked you, so to speak. What do you consider barriers in further pursuing this research to further examine some of the questions that you're trying to study?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I mean, there is resistance among social scientists. This is a new way of thinking that as a social scientist, you're really trained to think in terms of environmental independent variables, that the economy is strong, therefore it's going to be a good year for incumbents as an environmental variable and a dependent variable of interest. So I think we need to just pound away at social scientists and say, look, this is not threatening. It's not taking away all that you know about the environment. It's just saying that we need to interact genetics with the environment. And the way that Caspi has done, that to me is the template. Because he's not saying that whether or not you were abused as a child is irrelevant. He's saying to understand that relevance even better, you need to understand some of this genetic variation. So I think once I've actually been invited to give a lot of talks recently around to political science departments. And there's a little bit of hostility at first, but if you can sit down and talk to them for an hour, it's amazing that they say they are much less threatened by it. Or at least maybe they're being polite. But that's my sense. And especially the younger people, the graduate students are always the most excited, which gives me a lot of hope, Prem, that, I think they haven't been kind of indoctrinated into this belief about the irrelevance of biology to social behavior. And so I think we're going to win in the long term. I think we have a little bit of work to do with biologists as well. I think some of these things I mentioned about the epigenetics and the intergenic regions and the flexibility of the genes and the really fascinating interaction of the environment with the genes. I think focusing on behavior can be helpful to biologists as well, as opposed to just looking at the eye color of a fruit fly. You really have to get down there and look at some of these nuances, and it's going to be a daunting task. I mean, it's incredibly complex, but I just think it's going to be great fun.
Assuming that certain, alleles are longer than others, and different populations might, have different traits, could it be possible that certain populations could have a genetic factor to be more apt to go to war or be more politically aggressive than others?
You started this.
Sorry, John.
I suppose that's possible. I think it's doubtful. In fact, we had a conference here just a couple of weeks ago, and one of the papers presented was on the influence of testosterone and some other hormones and neurotransmitters and violence. And the subjects were asked to play a kind of a war game and make decisions about whether or not to invade other countries. And they didn't find any relationship at all between the level of testosterone and going to war. And I think part of the reason may be that testosterone is probably involved with physical violence and really having violence, not just saying, okay, well, I think maybe some army of mine over there should go to war. I think it's the difference between engaging in a bar fight and sending your troops to Iraq to fight. So, I think we have to be careful there in thinking that there's some kind of direct parallel between people who are aggressive in the social way that I was describing and people who might be aggressive politically. So, what you say is true, but I'm skeptical that it will be quite that neat.
In a follow-up to that question, when you mentioned testosterone leads right into my question, did you notice significant differences between men and women, gender-based, specifically because of biological differences or perhaps evolutionary biology?
Also a subject I was hoping to avoid. I mean, there are genetic differences between males and females. Males have an XY chromosome, and females have two X's. So that's definitional, really. There are differences. Whether these differences manifest themselves in behavior is still something that needs to be worked out. And it's, of course, very controversial, as Larry Summers found out. In our particular study, one of the things that's a little bit disturbing is that the differences in male and female twins is really quite dramatic. There are some traits where there appears to be strong heritability for females and weak for males, and then vice versa. Some traits where the males seem to be inheriting that trait. There could be a very complex explanation for that, or it could be nothing. But I think we sometimes gloss over that, and we probably shouldn't. I mean, there is a deeper story to be told there. There may be a certain set of traits which makes sense for females to be more likely to inherit. But right now, it's too early to draw any conclusions about that. I should say, though, with regard to gender, the tradition is to eliminate all dizygotic twins who are mixed gender. You can't have monozygotic twins who are mixed gender. Again, that seems obvious, but it's amazing how many people get that wrong. But DZ twins can be male and female, and those are eliminated from the analysis. But I think your question is on target.
I just had a question about whether or not you did any research, or in your findings, if you did, on twins who were maybe separated at birth. And if, when you were talking about party affiliation, did those two twins that may have been or may not have been separated at birth, did they link together in their party affiliation?
Good question. It turns out that twins separated at birth are really fairly rare. They're a fascinating group of people, and the people at Minnesota have collected as many of them as they could, but there are probably about 150 pair that really have been separated enough to say that they are separated. A lot of them had a little bit of contact, but how much does it take to kind of pollute the sense that they were indeed separated at birth? So this is a very rare group of people. These studies have been replicated on twins separated at birth, and the findings are identical. So, this doesn't give us any reason to throw up our hands and say, well, this isn't true. But beyond that, I guess I'm a little reluctant to draw too many firm conclusions given the paucity of twins who have truly been separated at birth. For some reason, that reminds me of one other point that may be of interest to you. There's a big difference in twins as well, not just whether they're monozygotic or dizygotic, but about 2/3 of monozygotic twins are also what's called monochorionic, and that means they've been in the same outer sac. And there are actually a handful of twins who are monoamniotic, which means that the innermost sac, they've been the same. And the level of correlation ratchets up with each increase in similarity. That is, monozygotic and monochorionic twins are more similar than just monozygotic, I'm going to screw this up, and dichorionic twins. So that to me is amazing. These very subtle environmental changes that can have such an impact on whether or not the twins are similar or not. So I think, the more I study genetics, the more impressed I am with the effects of the environment.
Taking into account the stage of your research, I'm kind of interested in kind of an evolutionary population implications of these things. For instance, did you find statistically that your cells were balanced for the absolutist and contextualist cells? Or, to put it in other terms, is one side more fertile than others? Will there be a drift over time in the population? And also, coupled with that, is there any dominance or regressive characteristics to these that might take hold as time goes on?
I don't know about the latter, but actually there is research on the former. And some of you may be chagrined to find out that conservatives or absolutists are outbreeding liberals. by quite a margin. This is research that's been done partially by Nick Martin, who is in Australia, and he's somebody that we're flying down to meet with really in about a month. He's one of the world's leading behavioral geneticists, and that's his very provocative finding, is that conservatives are having more kids than liberals.
I wanted to revisit that bimodal distribution you had for the political situation. You're kind of suggesting a couple of different possible explanations for that. I wondered if you could also consider the possibility that you really have just a monomodal thing there, but what you're looking at in politics is largely a matter of an adaptation to competition, such that people tend to take sides, and that hence when you have people who are pretty much politically similar, they will inevitably tend to split apart into two separate groups if you try to pick on anything particularly that divides two groups like left and right or liberal and conservative. Or
Tell me just a little bit more about this notion of attitude toward competition. How do you think that plays out with liberals and conservatives?
Oh, just that, that liberal and conservative would not be the primary categories.
Right.
What you would have is simply a common human characteristic of being competitive and tending to take sides, such that in that case, if you take a population, most of the members will tend to split into two separate groups as members of one side or the other.
Right. So, well, it's certainly the case that we're very groupish creatures, and at the drop of a hat, we'll identify with one group or the other. I guess I hope there's something more to it than that we can try to get some compass on why we form the groups that we do. But I wouldn't rule out the possibility. I've suggested it to my colleague who convinced me that wasn't true, that there really was something unique about being a liberal or a conservative. But hopefully time will tell.
Dr. Hibbing, my question is, you talked earlier a little bit about the effect of our diet on biology. Mm-hmm. Do you think at some point you might get to a place in your research where you would be able to make a connection between our diets and our political ideology or beliefs somehow?
Well, I guess that's better than the question I often get, which is somehow genetic engineering to make all liberals or all conservatives. And now we're just going to feed them Big Macs and make them all liberals or conservatives or something. But I guess that was a reference to some work that's been done to go back to oxytocin. There are certain people who believe that a heavy diet of legumes can affect the oxytocin system and therefore make people more trusting. Now, that's a long way from being liberal or conservative, but it does suggest some behavioral differences as a result of diet. This all sounds a little bit far out right now, but I think just looking at the explosion of papers on that kind of topic, I wouldn't be too quick to dismiss it.
Just curious about the size of the groups you were using, mm-hmm. and also the distribution in gender and the distribution in age.
Oh, okay. The twin studies, we were fortunate to have access to a twin registry that was very large. And so the ends were up there, but very briefly. There was about 5,000 twin pairs in each group. So this is a lot of twins. So that part I think is pretty solid. The gender distribution, and by the way, monozygotic twins are much less common than dizygotic twins, but they're also much more likely to participate in studies such as this. So you end up getting a fairly equal number of MZs and DZs. The gender distribution, I don't remember specifically. I think it was a little bit overrepresented toward females, but I'm not sure about that. And the last part of your question I wanted to comment on, but now I've forgotten it. Age. Yeah, that's a good point, because this could affect the results. This was a fairly old sample of twins. It was a mid-Atlantic state twin registry, and they supplemented that with some AARP twins, who you might expect to be old. And this is not a trivial concern, because it turns out that similarity among twins does increase with age. I think it's interesting in and of itself. It suggests, so these are twins that are living apart from each other longer and longer, and they become more and more similar. I think that shows some of the power of genetics. But it also suggests there might be a slight overestimate then. I mean, if what I said is just true, and this is an older sample of twins, the estimates of heritability might be just a little bit inflated. Our big goal right now is to, Prem will be happy to write a grant proposal where we go back with a new study of twins, because these questions come from the mid-'80s. And we were fortunate that these geneticists asked some political questions. Most of them are very focused on personality traits, and especially on alcoholism and tobacco usage and drug abuse, because that's where the money is. That's where most of the grants are. And these guys just threw on this battery of political items toward the end as kind of an afterthought, and we were able to use it. What we'd like to do is go back with a purely political survey where we could really get at political behavior and a richer concept of what it is to be liberal or conservative with a modern set of twins that was age representative. One more? Oh, wait.
It's my job. One more.
The guy that was talking about, vulnerability for human beings to, pick a side and so forth. I think what he was referring to is, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right, but Doverger's law, which says, in a democracy where, there's no rules written to power sharing among political parties, such as, a democracy where 51% of the vote will get you a victory just as well as 100%, that there's an inevitability that would come down to two parties, exemplified between American democracy or a parliamentary, Western Europe democracy. So I guess the way you can look at it is, when we pick a political party, if we're vulnerable to picking either a Republican or Democrat, we do it on the basis that one of the parties, holds more true to political ideology, but it's inevitable we're also going to come up with, tiny disagreements within that political party. So, for instance, what kind of, binds what it means to be liberal or conservative. For instance, we know what their positions are on maybe trade policy and abortion, but is there really a correlation between, abortion and trade policy? And I guess the best example of this would be like the Catholic Church, which is known to take a very liberal stance on economic issues, but conservative stance on social issues. And I guess what he was asking is, how much of that did you factor into your work here?
I don't know if this will answer your question or not, but it does raise a good point, which is, if these things have a genetic basis, then they can't just be some kind of ephemeral spin-off of the nature of the system today. And to me, it's amazing. If you go back in time, the consistency of a liberal versus conservative kind of division, frequently we call it different things, but it's still there. And if you move across the world, what it is to be an absolutist or a contextualist is really fairly common all around the world. If you're familiar with French politics, Jean Le Pen is a populist right-wing guy who's anti-immigrant. You could close your eyes and he would seem like David Duke. You've got the same kind of attitude toward in-groups and out-groups. And, certainly you have to be too careful. You have to be careful about making these generalizations. But I'm amazed at the extent to which you see traits that really don't have to go together, but they seem to. Today and 200 years ago in the United States and around the world. We need to do more research on that. I'd like to apply those kinds of questions that I showed you about, do you think society works best when we punish rule breakers or not? I'd like to see if there is a division, in New Guinea and in the United States. And if there is, I think that's going to support this kind of deeper undergirding of a potential genetic effect. If it all is just contextual, that's another story. In closing, though, I have to say, be careful about framing issues. I think we can frame issues so many different ways, and that could make an issue appeal to an absolutist or a contextualist. Think of the Iraq War. Right now it appeals mostly to absolutists. But you could probably put a contextual spin on that. Somehow we have to make Iraq safe for Iraqi schoolgirls to go to school, or whatever it might be, a human rights kind of thing, rather than they're bad guys over there and we need to go get them. So I think you can have the same issues that might be supported by an absolutist or by a contextualist. It just has to be framed by the leadership in a different fashion. So I think that my closing remark would be that we have to be very sensitive to those kinds of issues, not just say absolutists will always believe this or always believe that. I should have said when Kevin started that he's a valuable member of this team as well. He's a political scientist who is equally confused as I am and who has emboldened me into thinking about these new ideas. So it's been great just having him down the hall, and I appreciate him fielding questions.
I'd like to thank the audience for the provocative and interesting questions. There is a reception immediately following the talk in the Regency Suite, so if some of you did not get to ask a question of John, you can track him down there. Final thing, I'd just like to thank everybody responsible for putting on this talk, making it possible, and just one final time thank John for a very interesting presentation.